Naming conventions are huge, not only in your sessions, but also naming conventions within the project and keeping those really consistent. Like I create a new Pro Tools session for every new thing that gets done. So by the time a song gets done, I might have 20 or 30 Pro Tools sessions, and it's my system. I developed it over the course of probably 15 years, and it works for me.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. This episode is sponsored by SonarWorks, helping you get the most out of your mixes by correcting the sound of the speakers and headphones in your studio so you get your mix right the first time. Are you sick of doing multiple mixes and still you can't get the low end right? How would it feel to have badass bass the first time? Get a 21-day free trial at sonarworks.com. Are you ready to rock the perfect mix? This episode is sponsored by OWC, Other World Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, your trusted source for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and use Macs for your studio. Let OWC focus on keeping your studio Mac in killer condition so that you can focus on making great music. Why ditch your existing Mac when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and learn how you can supercharge your studio Mac. The speed to create, the capacity to dream. Find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Ryan Sutton, who originally thought he was going to be a professional golfer, but fortunately his passion for music drove him to learn many instruments, including guitar, bass, keys, drums, and then the studio. Ryan's uncle, Bob Gaudio of the Four Seasons and Broadway's Jersey Boys, brought him into the studio and gave him a masterclass in writing and producing based on his work for some of the biggest artists of all time like Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, Neil Diamond, Diana Ross, Frank Sinatra, and Michael Jackson. Bob invited Ryan to engineer and mix projects for Frankie Valli and the Jersey Boys film soundtrack and international stage productions. Ryan also worked under producer Ted T. of MuteMath and For King & Country. Ryan also got to play on For King & Country's 2X Grammy-winning album Run Wild, Live Free, Love Strong, as well as projects for Phil Joel, the Newsboys, and Big Daddy Weave. In addition, Ryan has had the pleasure of writing and recording custom music jingles, as well as doing post-production mixes for Coca-Cola, Crystal Burgers, Nike, BBC LP, Building Products, Payless Shoes, and many, many others. Please welcome Ryan Sutton to Recording Studio Rockstars. Ryan, are you ready to rock, dude?
Bring it, man.
Obviously, you've done some really cool stuff, and I've kind of briefly touched on it in the intro, but tell us in your own words briefly about your introduction into recording and, getting to the point that you're at now. I mean, pretty cool to have a family influence like that really can bring you in to start out on some pretty wonderful records.
Yeah, it was really, really cool. I mean, I grew up in Southern California, and actually my first memory that I have in life is at the studio that Bob had in LA. And it was actually, I don't know, I was probably 3 years old playing ping pong with my aunt in the lounge. And so, music had always been around. My mom plays piano. My dad plays guitar. They both, sang in church when I was growing up. But the recording thing happened when I was 15 or 16. I was up at Bob's, and he gave me a 4-track cassette recorder, old Fostex, that he would use for writing demos and, that kind of thing. So he gave me that in the manual and said, go have fun. So I got home. I was totally jazzed to do some, masterpiece recording. And so
was this computer times?
No. This is cassette.
I know. But like, we hadn't entered computer times. It wasn't like your uncle wasn't like,
right.
here, have this relic and go learn how to record on it. Or anything.
Yeah. At that point, this was the mid 90s. So what was
very legit, very legit.
Yeah. So, it was like the crossover ADATs were still popular and all that stuff, but he just had this laying around.
I'm still a huge Guided by Voices fan.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Those guys were famous for their 4-tracks and stuff like that.
Yeah, no. So I got home with my new toy and laid down a really bad drum and a really bad guitar and probably a really bad keyboard or something. And I realized I only had one track left. And so, but I had more than one idea. So I call Bob and I say, look, here's the situation. I only got one track left, more than one idea. What do I do? And he said, well, you got to ping pong the tracks. And I'm like, what the heck is ping ponging tracks?
You're like, I was playing ping pong at the studio.
Yeah, right. I've done that. I'm good at that. I said, well, what's ping ponging tracks? And he said, so you take the first 3 tracks, get a blend that you like, record them to the 4th, and now you have 3 tracks free again. You have to make sure, however, that you like the blend that you just recorded because you're stuck with it.
Yeah.
The minute that you start recording over it. And once I really got a hold of that flexibility, it was a number of years later that I realized this is how the Beatles did it. This is how the Four Seasons did it. This is how all those old bands did it. They just kept bouncing stuff around. And my mind that day was blown. And I was hooked. Literally hooked. Just couldn't believe that I had that kind of flexibility.
I remember thinking, well, first of all, I just remember thinking 4 tracks were exciting. There were a lot of things about 4 tracks that that we've given up to a little bit by going to computers. One of which is the fact that they don't sound perfect. They have a sort of built-in a little bit of distortion from the mic trees. They have EQs in there, so you can kind of freak out the sound just a little bit if you want. You've got all this tape compression built in. And then these things like committing to that. Plus, it was really easy a lot of times you had a speed adjustment. So you could easily slow the tape down slightly and sing another higher part, or speed it up and sing a lower part and like get cool effects. And then, of course, let's not forget flipping the tape over. What happens when you do that?
Wild. It's just weird. It sounds like if you flip the tape, you talking about playing it backward?
Yeah.
That just sounds like Satan's coming out of your speakers. I mean, it's just like, to me, it's just like the soundtrack of my nightmares. is really what it winds up being.
I love it. Well, very cool, man. So, but you had a chance to like work in the studio with your uncle as sort of a first experience too?
No, I did, but actually more on the artist side. I briefly was kind of doing a duo thing, kind of like not musically, but in terms of the face of it, kind of like the Eurythmics, where it was like there was a gorgeous female vocal out front, and then there was kind of the production mind behind it, writing and all that kind of stuff. And that really didn't go anywhere, but we had done some recording and my uncle helped us a little bit with that. That would have been my first foray into doing anything with him at all. I actually didn't start doing anything for him till way later.
Okay.
And we can get into that now if you want, but there was a very, very good reason for that. But I had probably been working for, 15 years before I ever really did anything with Bob.
What a trip.
Mm-hmm.
So what was some of the first studio stuff you got to get into? Did you jump into Pro Tools, in the late 90s and all that kind of stuff?
I actually got, it was made by Akai. It was called the, I'm losing
with the beta cassettes in it.
Well, no, it had hard drives in it. It was it was a 16 track. I forget what the model number was. I think Roland made one.
The
direct competitor.
1608 or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
I know which one you mean. Sorry, Rockstars. I'm blanking on the brand name. Actually, I like to say that it's kind of fun to just forget about all these model numbers and names over time. I mean, you don't really have to clutter your brain with all the things. if you do this for 20 years, you're going to have to forget a lot of things to make room for the new stuff that's coming anyway.
Yeah. Boy, isn't that the truth?
I think it was the 1680.
That could be.
But yeah, so that was a very cool one. So you were working on those sort of like the all-in-one digital studio boxes. And then, you used to have to mix it down to a CD and then export that out and spit it out and burn it and go play it in the car to get your mixes out and stuff.
Yeah, I would go from out of that Akai into a DAT machine. And then I would go from a DAT machine to my uncle, up to Bob's house, because he had a CD burner. And this is before CD burners were really ubiquitous in computers.
Right. This is when it was like $25 for a blank CD still.
Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of the process that I went by. And so it was time between, okay, I'm mixing this down to the DAT, taking the DAT up to Bob's. So I had this downtime to really, really hope that what I was doing was good. And that, or it was just, disappointment, when what didn't work, or I needed to tweak something and all of that. And so the process was longer, but what it did for me, and something that I learned from working even on as far back as on the 4-track, was I need to get it good soon,
right,
and not wait. So if I want to have the closest you can come to guaranteed great sounds coming out, I've got to start with great sounds going in.
That's always a good choice.
Yeah, that was really one, going back to what Bob said about you better like the blend when you're ping-ponging the tracks, because you're done.
So
you're done with it.
What are some other things that come to mind as far as getting great sounds going in? Like, what are some immediate things that you remember, proactively doing to get that?
Yeah, it was a lot of time not recording, quite honestly. It was, as a guitar player, starting out on guitar, it was, okay, I need to get a great sound out of the amplifier before I ever stick a mic in front of it. Once I kind of, got more and more comfortable with that, I had a couple of books that I had found at like Barnes and Noble or something on recording, just, kind of some basic books, and, talked about some basic mic placement of things and all of that. And started realizing really early on things I didn't like versus things I did like, with miking things. But I was only miking my stuff and working with my stuff. And it was totally different when I started working with other people's instruments, because it's like a fingerprint. They're all different.
Yeah.
And
do you feel like when you were recording your own stuff, you were sort of like learning, one technique to do things, and then you realized you needed to expand that when you started recording other people?
Yeah, I think it was, I was learning one way to do things, but paired with that, I was also getting a foundation for at least a place to start. 57 right on the grill cloth, right at the dome of the tweeter, or at the speaker, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of stuff. If that doesn't sound good, okay, well, I can move it around a little bit to get, darker sounds, brighter sounds, whatever. But even with things like that, getting great sounds out of the guitar itself. Is your guitar in good shape? Is it set up properly? Is it in tune? I mean, tuning, holy cow. So, but yeah, those were the kind of things really, really, really early on that were like instrumental in realizing I got to get
good pun there. Good pun.
Yeah, I tried not to go there, but it happened anyway.
All right, so let's back up for just a sec, because you covered a lot of topics. So without getting too deep into it, give us some brief overviews of things like, intonation. What is intonation? How does it work? Why is it important for a guitar before you even begin to play the song?
Well, having your instrument in good condition is like being a singer and being in good voice. And, but it's also recognizing what you're hearing. And I've been playing guitar now for almost 30 years, and I can strum a chord. And if something's a little out of tune, I know exactly which string it's on, and I know exactly if it's flat or sharp.
Yeah.
And so, but that's just from doing it and doing it and doing it and hearing it and over and over and over again. And so, I think on a guitar and bass, things where intonation is dependent upon how you physically are pushing down on the instrument, getting a good technique with that is really important, because you can push down too hard, you can not put, and it'll go sharp, or you cannot push down far enough and the thing just buzzes.
It's interesting. It just reminds me that there really is no workaround for training your ear and learning to, learning by ear, for example. Sometimes people talk about learning music as like learning by ear versus learning to read. But ultimately, if you want to play your instrument well, you have to learn by ear. You have to learn whether or not that chord sounds in tune when you play it,
Yeah.
Like you said.
Absolutely. Unless all you do is play with a keyboard.
True. And even then you do, because keyboard sounds don't, sometimes are pitched differently and that sort of stuff. But do you want to introduce the rock stars to just the very basics, the concept of moving the bridge to adjust intonation on a guitar and that sort of thing? Is that something that you know how to do yourself?
You know what? I actually don't. But I'll tell you, can I give a quick plug?
Sure.
Okay. There is someone here in town in Nashville, for those of your listeners that are in Nashville, that does by far the greatest setups known to mankind that I have ever played, and also anyone who's ever taken a guitar has ever played. His name's Gaudio. It actually happens to be Bob's son.
Shannon. Hey, well, let's slow that down and spell that out for people.
Sorry, I'm talking fast.
No, it's all right. Shannon
Gaudio. Shannon, Gaudio.
Gaudio, like that?
Gaudio.
Gaudio. Okay, cool. All right, rock stars. Google it.
Yeah. And if you Google or go on Instagram or any of the socials, it's Kiss My Axe.
Nice.
Awesome.
Yeah. Do you think, just out of curiosity, since somebody's wondering this, is that the sort of service where you could actually ship your guitar to them, get it set up, and then shipped back, or would you pretty much have to be local for something like that?
I don't know if he does shipping. I could certainly ask him, but shipping is always going to make your guitar wonky. So when you buy a new guitar, if you buy a new guitar from wherever, Guitar Center, or even Amazon for that matter, the first thing you got to do is get it set up, because more than likely it has not been properly set up out of the factory, and certainly a retailer is not going to go set it up for you.
Well, let me break down a few of the things about setting up a guitar that I know about, just to help the rock stars be aware. Three things that come to mind right away, rock stars, is your neck. When you hold the guitar up, and you've got sort of the bridge piece up by your eye and you're looking down the neck, you can see whether the top side of the neck or the bottom side of the neck have a little bit of curvature to them. And if it looks straight, you're in good shape. But if it's got some curve, then that's when, a professional might go in and adjust the truss rod a little bit, slightly tighten it or loosen it, which can pull the headstock of the guitar, where the tuners are. It can pull that back or forward a little bit, and so that can kind of make sure the neck's straight. And then the next place that is really important for intonation is, a lot of times with the bridge pieces, you can adjust the saddles of all the strings. And this, of course, you're familiar with, Ryan, but it moves the saddle forward down towards where the tuners are, or it moves it away from the tuners. And that's actually shortening and lengthening the string slightly when you do that, which means that your 12th fret and where all the frets are hitting the string are either hitting them a little lower on the string so that they're fretting the notes a little bit flatter, or they're fretting them a little bit sharper, or, of course, ideally they're fretting them right in tune. And then last but not least, this is one that I discovered when I took it to go to get it set up professionally, was there's, down when you're playing open chords, like you talked about, Ryan, where you fret the chord and you can really hear how the tuning is going.
Right.
It's also affected by the nut down at the very end. If the nut is tall and you press down on a first or second fret on the guitar, you're actually having to pull the string down a little bit further, which again moves the pitch up slightly more than it needed to. So sometimes they'll shave and file down the nut so that the string doesn't have to travel so far to get to the fretboard. So there you go. Those are my three tips to just be aware of.
Awesome.
Cool, man. Well, so all right. Well, bring us forward to working with your uncle.
So yeah, I had been working for a long, long time just on my own. I was doing, songwriter demos for publishers here in town, independent projects, that kind of stuff, and always was kind of a little bit disappointed that Bob would be working on something and I wouldn't get a call, and Bob would work on something else and I wouldn't get a call. And I learned later, once I started working with him, I don't even know if it's something he actually ever told me, but it was just something I realized, was that his name carries so much weight in the industry that he couldn't, for lack of better terms, jeopardize his reputation professionally attaching his name to mine.
Interesting, yeah.
And I totally understand that.
Whereas for me, it's no problem, Ryan.
Yeah, it was, but what had happened was it meant that I had, once I started getting the calls to do stuff, it meant that I had achieved a certain quality of product, quality of delivery.
Right. No, that's cool.
That he was like, yeah, okay, I can attach my name to this and not even blink.
I think that's an important reminder to us too, because while what you're describing is on a pretty big scale, the clients that your uncle was working with, I think a lot of us are faced with people that we know that we would like to, or that are maybe doing great work, and we're like, man, I really wish I could just do something with them, or I wish they'd bring me in on something. And in a different way, everybody's always faced with having to deliver on something, right? It's like, if you're really doing this professionally or trying to get something done, then you got a project and you got to get the work done. And despite how much you like your friends and would love to have them come work with you or something, the truth is you just got to get the job done. And so you're always going to, be compelled to do that in a way and work with somebody that can just deliver it. So, we shouldn't take it personally when we don't always get invited in on the session right away, and like you said, the point at which you do, it's a reflection of the fact that you're being seen for being able to get the job done now, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's projects that I've produced where I have brought in friends of mine to play on them, but it was only because I knew they could do the project. And in that respect, they were capable first and friends second.
Right.
And, because I'm not, if I'm producing a project, I'm not responsible to them. I'm responsible to the artist or actually whoever's paying for it.
Right. Totally.
Ultimately. And so, working with friends or in my case, with Bob working with family, that is a little bit of an icing on the cake. But even working with Bob, there is a difference in, hey, I'm going over for dinner with my wife, and that dynamic versus, okay, now I'm his engineer.
Right.
And I serve at his behest in that capacity. Now, after we're working, we could go down to the kitchen and go have drinks or cigars. I'm a big cigar guy, and so is he, or dinner for that matter. And I can rip on him,
right.
But I would never do anything like that in a session.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I was going to say, when you go over for dinner, I'm sure he's probably bringing you a coffee, but when you're engineering for him, you're damn well bringing him a coffee probably. Right.
Right.
So how about some specific things about, the production and engineering process that you witnessed and learned from your uncle in those sessions that you remember?
Yeah. There's been a wide range of them. The first sessions I was doing with him weren't even for recordings. They were for the Broadway play Jersey Boys, when there would be a new cast that was created to go to, pretty much anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. We would do what was called Frankie Camp. because these guys would go through the audition process and, and all of that, which was pretty dang rigorous. And so by the time that they got to Bob, everyone knew they could sing, everyone knew that they could dance, and, they looked the part and all that stuff. What Bob wanted to do in these Frankie camps, as they came to be known, was teach them to sing like Frankie. And they would come in and, they could sing falsetto like Frankie did.
And this is they could Frankie Valli?
Frankie Valli, yeah, sorry. And they could sing falsetto. They knew the songs, and all that kind of stuff. But there were little things that Bob...
Isms, right?
Yeah, isms. That's a good one that Bob would want to work on that were fairly consistent, because Broadway singers, their talent is almost unparalleled, but they're the type of singers that can hold a note for a week, that kind of thing.
Nice.
And Frankie never did. And so when we would be going through, we had instrumental stems of the cast album that we would work off of. And we'd be using those and recording all of the takes and everything into Pro Tools from these camps. And Bob would just say, things like, look, Frankie doesn't hold the notes that long.
Frankie don't play that.
Yeah, exactly. But so it was getting a little bit more into that world, into, I would call it a more authentic world, as opposed to a more parody world.
Right.
And it always ended up serving them better, and they loved it. And we actually, since we were at a studio recording all of this stuff, I was able to send them on every song we did. Here was the first take you did, and here is Bob's approved approach on this song.
Nice.
And so they had that, because they'll, if you're not always in training, so to speak, you'll slip into old habits, or the road can be pretty weary if you're, part of a road company. And so they would always have that as, we called it their Bible, to always go back to and say, okay, I'm sounding like this, but I need to sound like this. What were all of the things that we did to go through that? So that was, that kind of thing was the very, very first thing I did for Bob, were those Frankie camps.
Well, I bet for you that was, I would imagine it was eye-opening, because, you might think about singing as like something, that you've either got or you don't go into the studio, or that it's about hitting notes. And then, to see that there's probably like an extreme level of manipulation that can happen in intention, and just like whether the word is short or long or expressed in a different kind of way, was probably eye-opening to you for production.
Oh yeah, absolutely it was. And it, what's the saying? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
Right.
That kind of thing. I think someone actually wound up saying stealing is the most.
Right. Totally.
I might have Keith Richards or someone like that. But so on my records, all of those things that I learned in those Jersey Boys sessions, I use for myself. I have to apply them a little bit differently, because the artist is different, the product is different, but the principles, they hold over for the most part, no matter who you're working with. And so it could be anything from breathing, breathe here, or phrase this way, or, little things like
breathing. Breathing is so huge, dude. It took me a while to realize that.
Support the note.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many times where you can not be paying close enough attention as a producer, and a certain part of the song just goes weak, and you feel it, but you're not sure why, until you break it down. You're like, oh, it's just as simple as this. They just need to breathe right here. Yeah. So there's enough breath to actually get through the rest of that whole line in the chorus or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, they run out of gas. And so you got to find a place for them to be able to take the breath. And a lot of times what I'll do, especially with newer singers who might not be as experienced with this, is when we're working at my studio for tracking vocals, I'll have the lyrics in front of me, and we will actually sit down and listen to, the rough vocals, or, just go through the instrumental on it if we don't have a rough pass. And we'll sit there with pens or pencils or whatever and mark, this is where we're going to breathe, and just go ahead and map it.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that it won't change or can't be modified, but at least there's a place to start there, so that they have the best chance of performing the line right. And I mean, there's little things like, singers that if there is a note that needs to be held out for a long time, if you put a little bit of vibrato at the end of that note, what it subconsciously does to the listener is it says, don't worry about me. I know what I'm doing.
Interesting.
As opposed to holding a note and then the note just kind of ends. It sounds like you're just yelling a note to me, to my ear.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah,
Man. Cool
and
perspective.
that was something that I picked up from Bob, and finding it could be syllables or parts of a word to grab passion. He uses the word passion a lot, and I like that word. Things like, if you're going into the last chorus of a song, and you sing an O in front of it, whoa, and then you're into the chorus, that kind of thing. He said, if you put an H in front of that, O instead of coming in right with O, he's like, it's this immediate connection that happens with that note. And so I started trying it on my own stuff, and it sounds stupid, it sounds small, it sounds ridiculous or whatever, but good night, it works.
So, I'm gonna rock you or something like that. You're saying you start out with, oh, I'm gonna rock you.
Yep.
All right. See, I already sounded better.
Yep. See, yeah, you sound like a rock star.
So that's interesting. You talk about the vibrato too, because I've also seen a reverse situation. Sometimes when you're doing pop music and indie rock and stuff like that, there can be. I've worked with singers where there's too much vibrato, and the challenge is like, how are we going to straighten this vibrato out? So talk about that too. Talk about any, perspective on what to do when you're starting out with too much vibrato, and any tricks there?
Boy, truthfully, I have encountered that less. I've only encountered that with one, maybe two artists that I've worked with, and they both had enough control of their voice to control the vibrato.
Yeah. I think I've found that sometimes just bringing it up can be enough. You just bring it up to them, respectfully. Yeah. And sometimes they're just like, oh, and then they just sing it without vibrato. And you're like, oh, that was easy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And dealing with that kind of stuff, there's no two identical ways to work with it, because every singer, it's like a fingerprint. Every singer is different. And, I remember one of the girls that I was doing a project for, she had been classically trained. And so when you're classically trained, it's all about the vibrato. And her vibrato was gorgeous. It was absolutely beautiful to listen to, but had almost zero application in the record we were doing.
Now,
and so I said,
why is it that vibrato doesn't fit on pop records or even the one you were doing? Is it as simple as the fact that it's just too hard to build and stack harmonies to it? And doubles and things?
Yeah. I was doing a country project with her, and what it wound up being was I just heard it. The only word I could come up with for it was chaos, because there would be a song, and she had a very powerful voice, a little bit like a Tanya Tucker, kind of husky, female voice. But she had this huge vibrato from her classical training. And I found that the combination of the style of music, the character of her voice with a little bit of the raspiness with the vibrato, it was like taking up too much room is kind of the only way I would know how to put it. And so, especially, in music nowadays that is incredibly dense. And now if you gave her, a Celine Dion type track, that kind of thing. Yeah. And it would be like, let's do vibrato, until kingdom come.
All right. So here's a thought that comes to mind. I imagine showing up overdressed to more of a casual party, as being an example of like vibrato where it doesn't belong. And then you said Celine Dion. I'm like, oh yeah, that's where overdressed fits right in.
Exactly.
So maybe it's just like, the style.
I guess it would be the difference in showing up to a bar versus showing up to a ball.
There you go.
Something like that. I don't know.
Okay, cool. So how about sharing with us an inspirational quote, something to get us kind of excited to hit the studio? I like to ask that of our guests going into the podcast.
Inspirational quote. I would say one that really stuck with me wasn't even as much an inspiration. It was a work process. And you've probably heard it. A bunch of people in our field have heard it. Record as if there's no mixing, mix as if there's no mastering.
Oh yeah, that is a good one. I feel like that came up, somewhere in the past few months as well. And I like that. I think that's important. We were talking about that for this podcast. Rockstars, I've said this before, and I was letting Ryan know that I like to treat the podcast now like a live interview and not do any editing. I mean, we'll drop a marker and take out a complete clam, if I fart on the mic, I'm going to take that out for you
Please. Yeah.
Just kidding.
It's interesting. Another one, I was very fortunate coming out of school I won't mention the school. It's here in town. Everyone knows it. But I came out of there not knowing what I didn't know and thinking that I knew everything. And I got asked to run sound at a live event at a church here in Franklin, filling in for someone. And I don't remember what the contact was, but the guy who I was substituting for ended up coming in about 3/4 of the way through the concert. And he said, "Hey, this sounds really good." And I said, "Thanks." I just thought it was someone who was there or worked at the church. And he said, "Hey, my name is Chris. Are you Ryan?" And I said, "Yeah." "Are you Chris?" His name was Chris Yoakum. I said, "You're the one I'm filling in for?" He said, "Yeah." We got to talk and got to know each other a little bit that evening. And he said, "I need an assistant. Do you do studio work?" I said, "Well, that's actually most of what I do." He said, "I need an assistant. Would you like to come work for me?" And I said,
Nice.
"Absolutely." So the first session that I did with him, I don't remember who the client was, but he literally said this to me. I think he graduated from another school here in town. And this is what he told me. I jotted this down for this interview. He said, "I know what you learned in school, but I'm going to teach you how to make records." And what that meant coming from him was what you learn in engineering schools or engineering type programs is don't EQ going in, don't compress going in, just get it clean, get it safe. And the first session I went in with him, I can't tell you, it was a full band session, tracking day. Gobs of EQ, if it needed it, gobs of compression, if it needed it. But it boiled down to him wanting to take home a record that day, and give it to the producer. And it's like, yeah, we're 85% done.
Well, it's a lot more like that 4-track where you're committing to things as soon as possible.
Exactly. And so what that requires, though, is developing a gut and knowing how to get great sounds and having taste, because that's what people are paying for. They're not paying for gear. They're paying for your taste.
And I would add to that one of the only ways you're going to get there is if you're willing to take risks with your gut, and which by definition means you got to have room to be able to commit to things and screw up, and then decide later, which things are working when you commit to them and which aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And the beauty of working nowadays, I mean, you can screw up all you want because everyone's got a laptop and an Apollo.
Right.
Kind of thing. And so the accessibility to all of that is way higher than when I was in school and when I was coming up. There wasn't YouTube, there wasn't Google, there wasn't any of these things. And I kind of came in at the tail end of, I learned how to mix on an SSL 4000. And I still, when I get the opportunity to do that, I still love doing that. But developing the gut is a huge, huge one. And so when Chris said that to me, I'm going to show you how to make records, my world, it was the second time that my world got flipped. The first one being learning what ping ponging was. The second one is when he started showing me this stuff. And he was tough on me.
Yeah.
Because he's like, "I'm paying you. I can run you over a little bit." He was very nice. He did it because he knew I had a certain level of ability. But that was really, really important.
Well, that's cool, man. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, so can you remember a couple of different things that you learned from him in the studio as far as some cool tricks where when you saw that for the first time, you thought like, holy shit, this is how you get a bass sound, or this is how you get the coolest drum room sound.
Yeah, he would do kind of the standard stuff, in particular, like on drums, 2 or 3 kick mics, 2 snare mics, that kind of stuff.
Now,
But
let me ask you this. Where would you put
Right.
3 kick mics?
So he would do an inside kick that might be something like it could be a Shure SM91. It could even be a Beta 52, D112, D12. Outside, he might do like a FET 47, kind of maybe within a foot of the outside head.
Such a great outside head mic.
Oh yeah, they're fantastic, and they can take the level. And then the last one he would do, depending on the kick drum, because it's all dependent on what you're hearing.
Right.
What you use. And if it was a smaller kick or the kick was tuned higher or whatever, he might throw on one of those, Yamaha sub kick,
right.
Those kind of things, or the ghetto version, which is the reverse wired NS10 speaker.
Yeah. Let's break that down just in case there's a rock star who's not familiar with that yet. So describe what the NS10 speaker mic thing is.
So the NS10 mic speaker, in its original form, was literally the cone out of an NS10, where you would reverse the wiring, as I believe what it is.
Yeah, instead of going into the speaker and playing sound out, the speaker would vibrate from the sound of the drum and come out the wire into what would you use, a DI box, right?
I've used a pre, is what I've always personally used out of that. But the thing that it does is, because it's so big, it can get all the low end information. And so hence the term sub kick.
And it's filtered. It's like you don't, it filters out all the highs and mids and stuff like that.
Yeah, it probably filters out above, 500.
Yeah, it just gives you this pillowy sound.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I always wondered if it was like a perfect match to playing that kickback on an NS10 speaker as well.
Yeah. What's funny is NS10s as a microphone get such great subby, like you said, pillowy kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But as a speaker, get no bottom end.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. That's
true. So then Rockstars, you would blend those mics together and you bring in that, the sub kick, and it gives you sort of this pillowy, deeper low end of your kick. And then of course they turned it into an actual product, a branded product later.
Yeah, because it was pretty ghetto. I mean, I had seen them, suspended by rubber bands onto like a short mic stand. I mean, that you could get real ghetto with them at first, and then Yamaha made them look nice. But another one he would do is, and also he would oftentimes, and this is where committing and knowing your gut and all of that, he would, through the console, bus those to only one input in Pro Tools.
Oh, interesting. So all 3 mics down to 1 track.
Yep. And so he would do that. He would on the snare drum, I think he would keep these separate, but he would do, like a 57 on the top, 57 on the bottom or something like that. But he would point, I think it was an old EV mic, directly at the shell and run that through an 1176 and, whatever, I don't know, an API EQ, boost a ton of mids, I think, but he would compress the crap out of that thing.
And that just gives you like the clang out of the drum.
Yeah.
Right?
And so if you want something a little trashier to blend in, if it's a rock tune or something that's a little more, bombastic, it can give some attitude to the snare that the snare may not have acoustically, but because you're abusing the signal so much, you can bring in a different character with it.
That's super cool.
Yeah, I mean, he did a lot of the standard stuff, with room mics, crushing room mics. There wasn't a whole lot that was really unconventional that I can remember, because a lot of the sessions, as a lot of the sessions in Nashville move fast.
Yeah, totally.
And so there isn't always the time nor the luxury to say, hey, I'm going to take a 3-hour session and get drum sounds, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I would almost qualify that by saying it's more useful when you got to move fast to just try and capture a variety of possibilities.
Sure.
Like put the mic in the right place, knowing that later you can always compress it some more to like really dial that in. than to try and go for the absolute perfect finished thing in that little amount of time.
Yeah, if you're under a time crunch, absolutely. And there are the tools nowadays are so good that there is that flexibility there. What I found for myself in the projects that I produce or even engineer is I don't like to get bogged down in tracks.
Right.
So if I'm producing something, I'm not engineering it because I don't want to have my engineer hat on and my producer hat on that day. So I've used the same guy for all of my projects. He's one of the top guys in town. I'm sure you know him, Steve Marcantonio.
Oh, Steve's great.
Yeah, I love. And if he's good, my thing was if he's good enough for Dan Huff, he's darn well good enough for me. And that's aside from looking at his all music credits,
and
which are
Rockstars. Steve has been on the show, so you can always search on rsrockstars.com. Just search for Steve Marcantonio, and it'll take you to his episode as well. He tells some great stories about working in New York in the 70s and just great stuff.
Yeah. So, Steve is, about as good as it gets. And so, he does the stuff where, he's taking all the kick mics down to one, unless I'm specifying, that I don't want something like that.
Yeah.
And he gets creative. He's got his own thing. Cause that's another thing. When I said earlier, you're hiring for someone's taste, I remember the first record I did with him, we were at Ocean Way, and I got the tracks back later that day. And there was this track called Snare. What was it called? Snare Crush? Snare something or other. But what he had done was not put up a separate mic. He multed the signal out through the Neve, that giant Neve that's in there, and went through a whole separate chain and did the similar kind of like clanky, kind of aggressive sounding kind of thing, but without a microphone. And that was a different way to do it.
There's a good reason for that too. So it's a whole lot easier to mult something, spank it, as Tom Lord Alge would say, crush it, and then bring it in on another track. When you're still in the analog world, things, there can be micro delays, but generally speaking, everything is still locked together in time. You might have to flip polarity on something to make sure it's in phase that way. But doing the same thing in the computer can get a lot trickier because all of a sudden you start getting latency slippage between different tracks.
Yeah.
And you really got to have your ears on to know whether or not you're getting back what you thought you were going to get when you split a track and blend it back in, or if you're getting something that's coming back a little bit of slipped out of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, it's a different sound than throwing up another mic. And with drums, it's one less thing to have to worry about in terms of phase.
Right.
If you're doing it that way, because phase is you got to know what you're doing with phase and polarity and all that stuff with all those microphones.
And it's great if you got a console to work with where you can actually use a send to send some of the snare track or the overheads or whatever track you're doing to another compressor and then bring it back in on a new track. If you're doing it in my studio where maybe I'm relying on the patch bay for that trick, maybe I would take the output of the mic pre and mult it and then go into Pro Tools with one and go to a compressor for a nut, with the split and try and bring that back in. But when you start splitting things at the patch bay, you run into the risk of impedance loading down your sound and actually changing the sound slightly. So you really got to, again, be aware when you do that and pull your mult in and out and listen carefully to your original track and make sure you're not screwing it up a little bit.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for letting me jump in.
Yeah. Well, and another thing with something like that, these principles hold true for anything you're multi-miking. So, right. or having two different sources for one instrument. Like, so if you have a DI bass and a bass amp, it'd be the same kind of thing. And I've done projects where we took a DI out of the bass, a DI out of the pedal board, and an amp. And because the project kind of called for some of that flexibility, and we had to work with that a little bit.
What are some favorite ways for you to make sure that those multiple bass signals are lining up properly when they're in Pro Tools and you're going to mix? And any tricks? Do you do it visually? Do you use any plug-in tools, anything like that?
I don't use plugins for things like that unless it's, unless the amp's out of phase. But I tackle that stuff on tracking day. So unless I'm receiving something to mix, which I do, I'm not really ever messing with any kind of polarity because we make sure we have it that day. And so what I'll do in Pro Tools is just throw it in slip mode. If something needs to be bumped, usually the bass amp is a little bit behind the DI,
right?
Because it's got to go make a bigger round trip depending on, even something as simple as how long the cable is running to that. So I'll just do it visually, but it's still ear. And, I'm just trying to find where is everything having the most low end,
right?
And not sounding either scooped or lacking any low end, which can happen. But, that's generally what I do. It's nothing fancy. It's just going in and doing it.
One of the things that I find myself relying on when I'm trying to judge whether or not I've got that timing right between the DI and the bass amp is I might start by listening to the DI track and then slowly bring up the bass amp track. And I'm listening for whether or not the tonal quality of the bass shifts away from its original sound.
Yeah.
If the amp's an extremely different sound, then of course it's going to sound different. But
yeah.
I find that like if it's out of time phase, it'll shift because of the comb filter effect. It'll kind of shift the sound of it and stuff. There was another producer that you mentioned in your bio, Ted T, and I think you mentioned MuteMath. Was MuteMath somebody that you worked with him as well?
No, I didn't. He did I think it was the first 2 MuteMath records, and he found them.
Cool.
And he's a completely different type of producer than me or Bob. He's a piano player, and he's a big MIDI guy, and he works with audio as if it was MIDI, which was very eye-opening to me because I had never worked with anyone like that. So he's what I would call the comp king.
Okay.
In terms of flying stuff around, moving stuff, creating drum fills, all that kind of stuff. But no, the projects I worked on with him were the for King and Country stuff. And there was a record we did for Carmen. We did some stuff. I did some stuff briefly with Phil Joel with him, a little bit of Big Daddy Weave, and then some other, independent projects or, artists he was developing at the time and, that kind of thing.
Any particular, details you remember learning from him about, what you described as comping audio and building drum fills, like just stuff that you didn't think of until you saw it. And you're like, oh, I didn't think to do that.
Yeah, it really came I did a lot of his editing, and I would get a session, and he works in Logic. So I would get a Logic session. So not only did I have to get Logic, I had to get this crazy crash course in it. And, and it was good. He was patient, but, making it sound natural, was incredibly difficult. And that's not a reflection on anything Ted did or the playing or anything like that. It was incredibly difficult because I'd never done it before.
Right.
And so I would he and I worked he would send me the session with the audio, and I would just send him the session back because the audio wouldn't change. And so he would say, all right, we're close here. This needs some more help, work on this some more. And it was like that with vocals. He would comp down to the consonant in some places. And I saw it as a completely different type of creativity. And, literally it was taking audio and moving it around like MIDI notes. It was nuts.
So for example, he might send you the final drum comp, or he might send you a bunch of drums and just say comp them into something great. I generally wouldn't do the comp. He would do the comp and send it to me. And then would he want you to tighten things up or pocket or those kinds of terms? Can you explain to the rock stars what that means? I mean, that's sort of like a Nashville expression that I've heard used a lot. You know, people talk about pocketing things. What does that mean? I mean, people are going to hear that and be like, that sounds, I want to learn how to do that. I don't really know what it is though. So explain to the rock stars what pocketing stuff means in Nashville.
It's basically editing, you know, it could be a hit of a drum. It could be, you know, the pluck of a bass or strum of a guitar, but it's basically lining things up to the grid so that they're really tight.
Okay.
And Ted likes things really, really, really tight. And so his standards on that are incredibly high. And I wasn't prepared for that at first. I was good at editing. I had edited my own records, but his standards of it were exponentially higher than mine. And what it did was it opened me up to a world of editing and editing techniques that I had never thought of before. Because in some cases, you get backed into a corner and you're like, holy crap, how do I get out of this? How do I make this, you know, whatever sound somewhat natural?
Right. Because when you manipulate stuff a lot, things go to a new place that can feel very unnatural until maybe you finally get everything just right. Yeah. I remember feeling like that. There's editing and tightening things to the grid can feel like a very slippery slope, because as soon as the drums go to the grid, then it feels like now everything has to go to the grid, and now everything, you know, just keeps going and going. What about tools you used? Would you tighten drums in Logic, or would you be in Pro Tools and use things like Beat Detective, or would you use Elastic Audio or something like that?
Yeah, since he was in Logic, he wanted to keep it in Logic. So I had to learn to do it in Logic with him. I had learned to do it in Pro Tools with Beat Detective. And I think it's called Flex Time.
Right. I think you're right.
Had just come out in Logic. And so we were messing with that stuff, but more often than not, still found that just doing it manually was the way to go. And it's not, and clarification on what pocketing stuff is, we'll say with drums, you know, if you've got however many tracks of drums, say, I don't know, 10 tracks or whatever, you've got to move them all at the same time.
Yeah.
You can't line up your kicks and then line up your snares and then line up your hats and your toms, all that kind of stuff. They have to move as a unit.
Well, you can, it just won't sound very good.
Yeah, it'll sound like garbage.
And the reason Rockstars is because you'll be shifting the phase. Every hit, you'll change the phase relationship of all those multi-mics, and each, you know, you'll hit the snare here and it'll sound one way. You'll hit the snare, you know, in the next bar when you've shifted all the mics differently, and it'll sound completely different. So nothing will sound right. Right.
And it would be the same way if you have a multi-mic'd bass, or if you had multi-mic'd guitars. You know, anything like that, you've got to move as the entire take. But so with Ted, it was in Logic. I do it in Pro Tools. I really don't use Beat Detective. I find, and I know a lot of people that do, it's just a preference with me, that if I do what's called tab to transient, and that's basically I hit the tab button and it goes to the next transient that it detects. And I'll hit, Apple E on a Mac, and it'll separate that out.
Yeah.
And so I'll do a bunch of tab to transients, and maybe I'll do the verse. I'll get the whole verse done. And then what I'll do, because then I know my edit points are accurate. Then what I'll do is then I will use a function in Beat Detective that is called, what's it called?
Is it the crossfade and fill gaps or something like that?
That's part of it, but it's actually it's part of the quantizing part of it.
Oh, so you like Beat Detective for its quantizing ability?
Yeah, I don't like it for its separate, like with the purple lines or the pink lines. I don't like it for that because I don't think the detection is as good. And so that's what I do manually, and then I will use Beat Detective for actually moving everything. Some guys or girls will tab to transient and then manually move everything. And I've done that before too.
So here's another trick that's popping into my mind. I'm not doing this regularly, so I apologize if it doesn't quite work the way I'm going to describe it. But Rockstars, you could also, tabbing to transient through a whole song and chopping everything up is quite a lot of, you know, hits and beats to get to turn into little bits and pieces. But you could also use, I think you could set your nudge feature to 1 bar, and then you could tab to the transient of the first bar and then use the plus to jump a bar forward, and then maybe tab to transient to, nudge it right up to the beginning of that first kick. So you might be able to break it up into single bars first and, get things on the grid that way and stuff. But I've done, like you, I've done a lot of these things. It's been a long time because I'm not producing records with that kind of style so much anymore.
Yeah.
But I know how time consuming it can be.
Yeah, it is. It's I call it a necessary evil nowadays in a lot of ways. But interestingly, what happened coming out of doing that stuff for TED, because it was the same way with vocals. It was the same way with everything.
Yeah.
And what happened was the next project that I did, my editing was so, I'm going to pat myself on the back here. My editing was so good
That's
with
great.
it because I had gotten so good because I had been put through the fire with TED. And so a lot of what that did was it forced me to come up with really unorthodox ways of doing things that have served me in just about every project. And so I could beat detect an entire album, every hit, every strum, every whatever, to the grid. And it will never feel like it's on the grid.
It'll cool, never
feel like that. And a lot of that, there's a caveat to that. A lot of that is in the comping. If you're comping stuff that still feels really natural, then like I'm a big ghost note guy on drums. Mm-hmm. So I want my ghost notes in there and all of that. So that becomes a part of my comp. But when I'm lining stuff up, it does not feel like it's to the grid. And that was just something I learned. That was a byproduct of working with TED and being forced into like these incredibly, incredibly stressful situations. Because oftentimes TED works on the other side of the day. And so I would get a text at 11 o'clock. I remember, I'll never forget this. He texted me at like 11:30 one night and he said, "Hey, can you edit a banjo part for me and then send it right back to me?" I'm like, dude, I've been in bed an hour,
You're like, I've been in bed an hour, but yes, of course.
But yes, I will. And I did. And yeah, it was fun.
Well, I like to think that the first decade of making records were definitely the hardest sessions I've been on. And it was my graduate school, like going through hell and working with a particular artist who was just really, really driven to push our abilities and push the boundaries, like you're describing TED T, just get things exactly on, really, really be a perfectionist. And it drove me nuts a lot of times, but boy, did I learn a ton of shit. And an interesting takeaway from me that might have been similar for you is that doesn't mean that the other person we were working for was teaching us those things. It just means they were pushing us so hard that we had to teach them to ourselves and learn them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that happened on a project with Bob I did where it was like, this is what I want. I'm going to go leave because I have a meeting. And so I'll be back in a couple hours and I want to see what you figure out.
Nice, man.
But you can only, and this is something for your listeners, you can really only be able to walk into those situations with any kind of confidence. And even with the confidence that I have and the experience that I have, they're still nerve-wracking.
Oh, totally.
But the only way you can do it is because you've been doing it a long time and you have tons of experience if you're working for anyone else other than yourself.
Awesome. Well, Rockstars, we're going to take a short break now and come back in for the jam session. And when we do, I'm going to dig in with Ryan into a lot more specifics about recording, editing, comping, and mixing pro vocals in your studio. So we'll see you in just a moment. Reminder, you can find the stuff we're talking about in the show notes, rsrockstars.com, and then just use the magnifying glass to search for Ryan Sutton, or just look and you can click through right now on your listening device, whatever you're listening to this podcast on. We'll see you in just a moment for the jam session. You've already invested in your studio speakers, headphones, and treatment of the room. And you're passionate about creating great music, but your mixes don't seem to translate to the rest of the world. The reason is that your speakers and headphones are not telling you the whole story. The frequency response of your studio has huge peaks and valleys all throughout the low end that are completely screwing up your perspective. You may be doing your best to hit the bullseye with your mix, but your room makes the target of a perfect mix impossible to find. Wouldn't it feel great if there was a simple tool that could fix all that for you and help you get your mixes right the first time? Introducing SonarWorks Reference 4, the affordable solution to correcting your speakers and headphones in your studio. Built for Windows and Mac, SonarWorks helps you position your speakers, correct your control room imperfections, and get $1 million sound on a home studio budget. Get a 21-day free trial at sonarworks.com and start your journey toward the perfect mix. Are you using a Mac in your recording studio? Are you tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly? Wouldn't it feel great to have a trusted friend to help you keep your existing Mac and studio setup current and relevant so that you can focus on the thing you love most, which is making great music? Well, now you can rely on OWC, Other World Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, whose mission it is to help you get the most mileage out of your existing Mac. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD drive, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac that's ready to rock, OWC will help take your studio into the future with a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49. Why get frustrated and ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. Hey, rock stars, Lid Shaw, we're jumping back in now for the jam session. My guest today is Ryan Sutton, joining us from Franklin, Tennessee. We're actually doing this over Skype today due to rainy weather, sick children, and Nashville traffic. But Ryan, are you ready to jump in and jam?
I am.
Awesome. Well, I want to really dig in and help educate the rock stars on some great, advice from you about recording, editing, mixing, producing, pro vocals in the studio. And so let's just jump in with some questions like that. Let me begin at the beginning. What are some important things to know about setting up for a vocal session?
Oh boy. There's some things that you can do that aren't even gear related. It's lighting. It's, just the overall mood of whatever room you're in.
What about temperature? What's a good temperature?
Temperature is important. I will default to whoever I'm working with. If I need to put on a t-shirt or put on a jacket, kind of thing, that really doesn't matter to me, because in the end, I'm less concerned about my comfort and more concerned with theirs, because I can't give them what they want unless they give me what I need. And in order to do that, they got to be comfortable.
Right. So you just ask them whether it's too hot or too cold?
Yeah, I'll just say, are you good? Are you hot? You cold? You want something to drink? Anything like that. I always have teas and coffees and all kinds of stuff on hand for that. In terms of gear, I have a chain that I typically will go to 9 times out of 10. Sometimes it's different, but I know what it sounds like.
Break it down for us, if you would.
So I go U47 into a Brent Averill Neve.
Nice.
And then into Pro Tools.
Really? So no compression on the way in for tracking?
It depends on the vocal. It's interesting. My setup in my studio is a little bit more geared for the mix. And so I have some stuff, but because of how it's wired in, it's like this giant nightmare to use for tracking. So sometimes what I'll do, and quite honestly, I have found that my ear can't tell the difference and nobody else cares, really, is I will, in Pro Tools, set up an aux with the analog input being there on that aux. And I'll usually call it like lead vocal tracking aux, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I will I'll put a compressor on that track and then route that from that track to an audio track. And so I'm printing compression. I mean, we're not talking crushing, but I'm printing compression through the plugin.
And that doesn't, now what kind of a Pro Tools system are you using? And if the Rockstars try this at home, are they likely to run into some latency possible issues when they try that?
A little bit. I mean, I can run my sessions at 32, I guess, samples.
So are you using an Apollo or something like that?
No, I'm actually using an Antelope.
Oh, Antelope. Okay, good. So but you are native. So you do have to deal with latency.
Yeah.
Maybe touch on that for just a second. Remind the Rockstars, A, what is latency, and B, do we give a shit about it? Is it should we never worry about it, or is it a session killer?
It can be all. It can be all or none. I think latency is basically the trip that the audio takes to go from analog to digital. And the way, and so the latency is the way that the computer compensates for that.
Well, it's also the time, right, that it takes for the audio to go from the converter, through the system audio or whatever in a Mac into the DAW, get processed and come back out through the system to the converter so that we can then hear it in the headphones, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I find that the only people that have ever said it, I mean, 32 samples is like, I don't even know how long that is. I think it's like way faster than the blink of an eye.
Yeah, it's less than a millisecond if we're at 44.1.
Yeah, exactly. So I have only had one or two singers be able to tell, but it's because they're session singers, and this is all they do day in and day out. And I don't have a like a hearback system or an Avium or anything like that, to just take or a console to route that stuff through to where there is no there's no latency. So they're monitoring out of Pro Tools. I have never once had it be an issue. Never once had it be a session killer, ever.
Do you run into an issue where you're trying to play back the rest of the session looks closer to a mix, and that 32 sample buffer isn't enough buffer to handle playing back the session while you're trying to do this vocal overdub?
Once in a while that'll happen, but that's only if I'm tracking something that's already got a high track count, in the session. If I anticipate that might happen, what I'll do is I will print an instrumental stem of the session, just kind of a rough mix, and I'll bring that into a fresh session. Easy to do. Yeah, you just do a super fast bounce from the other session and then just import that in and start recording. A reminder, Rockstars, when you import it into the other session, it could be smart to make sure you start from the 0 point when you bounce out that rough to work with. Although you don't have to, because you can always import the vocal track back into your master session, and it should recognize that there's a timestamp to the audio, right? And line it up, or not necessarily. Yeah, you can. That's one of like the import options. What location do you want to put it at? Right. And you can put it at a timestamp. So yeah, that can work. I always do it from 0. That way I never have to think about it. Well, so dig it. So I'm just going to say back to you what you said to me, which I think is an important takeaway, and a reminder to the Rockstars. If we all have to spend our, hard-earned gear budget wisely. And in your case, it might have been for this reason or for others, but, you focused on choosing a really fantastic vocal mic, choosing a really fantastic mic pre, and you're done. You can put all your money into that instead of trying to have a whole scat of gear and consoles even and compressors and other stuff where the quality of what you're starting with might have been lower because you can use the plugins for the compression once it's in the computer and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, and plugins nowadays, good night. They're so good that, and they're getting better with, every passing month. And that line between is hardware better, is software better, or does it sound better or whatnot, is that gap is increasingly becoming narrower and narrower. Yeah, I know the difference when I mix on a desk because there's certain things I can hear, but those are going to be things that largely engineers hear and no one else cares about.
All right. So dig it. Let's keep jumping forward. How can we choose the right mic for a vocalist?
Listen to it. Listen to the vocalist through it. I mean, my 47, as good as it is, it has been beat, for lack of better terms, by other microphones because it sounded better on that particular vocalist.
Do you have a process? I mean, I guess if you only have a few mics, maybe it's easy to listen to the singer on those mics and choose which one you like best. When do you like to do that? Do you do that right when you're getting ready to go sing that first take? Do you make them sing on a bunch of stuff, or is that sort of a little bit of an energy killer? Do you try and do that first and then take a break and then come back in to just rock out now that you have a sound and a chain?
I've done it both ways. And I think that some of that's up to the artist. Some of that is up to how much time we have, and I did a record a couple of years ago where I had 2 weeks to get what I needed track wise and also all the vocals because the artist was going to go finish his last semester at college.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have a whole lot of time to, take the luxury for a bunch of mic shootouts. I had an inkling just based off of the demos that I was sent of what microphone was going to work. And it happened to be the 47.
Yeah. I think another reminder is sometimes we imagine that to make the right choice, we need to compare all the possible options and pick the best one. And that's not always true.
Right.
There's another take that really helps me out where I say, the moment it sounds good, it is good.
Yeah.
It's like
Absolutely.
if you've got something, you're like, that sounds great, especially comping vocals,
Mm-hmm.
I can worry about whether there's, but what about those 30 other takes? Wonder what's in there. But then I'm like, well, wait, this sounds great. Nobody's ever going to hear the other ones if I don't use them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and also, something for your listeners, don't be afraid to try 2 mics at once.
Okay, great. Let's dig into that. Give us the details on the best ways to do that.
Briefly, you got to make sure that the capsules are lined up. And obviously that the polarities are correct. But, if you find that one mic has a really great low end, for like, say, a male vocal has a really great low end presence, but something isn't quite jiving with the mids, throw a 57 up next to it.
Yeah, I've done that.
There's nothing that says that you can't use a 57 on a vocal.
I've done that, and I've run the 57 even to an amp to just get that kind of crunchy mid-range, and it helped bring the voice of this artist out in the mix, which was nice.
But like I said earlier, having the tools nowadays to be able to experiment with that kind of stuff on your own in your bedroom or whatever, you can already kind of develop a sense of what those sounds will be, and you'll just kind of have them in your mental Rolodex of options.
Yeah, and then you can also, if creating a sound in your studio requires a lot of setting, don't forget that you can have them in literally a photo, library. So you just take your iPhone and you take pictures of settings of things, create a little folder somewhere in your Google Docs, upload all that. Now it's like next time you need to throw up your 57 into an amp combo and you don't want to make the artist feel like they're waiting around for you to figure out how to get the right sound. Just pull up those photos, set it up really quickly, and then go from there.
I've done that. I don't do it like on a Google Doc thing. I'll actually take pictures of a few things and keep them within the session or the project file. And I'll take pictures of them so that they're always with the project. And I've done some stuff where we had to come back a few months later, and I had been working on other stuff. We had to come back a few months later if a song was added or we needed to change a vocal or something. And I literally was like, oh crap. But I remember I took those pictures. So I just went back to those pictures, dialed everything back in, and he's a very consistent singer, and there was no issue. You would never know. And it was a punch in the middle of a verse that we had to get, and no one ever knew.
That's great.
Yeah.
Are you using iPhones and Macintosh computers?
Oh yeah.
So are you talking about how would you take a photo and then get it into the actual session folder? Is it a simple process for you?
I mean, for me, what I'll do is I will take the picture and I'll either email it to myself or load it up onto Dropbox. And then just my computer is synced to my Dropbox account. and I'll just grab it from there.
Right. And then grab it from Dropbox and just drag it over to the actual session folder. That's
and I'll create a new folder that's like, if it's, if I track anything that I track here in my studio, I do that with. And anything I track at another studio, even if it's not me engineering, I get recall sheets just in case.
Yeah.
And it's a pain in the neck, but I want that flexibility if I need it. And so I'll just create a folder in the project, and it's just, say it could be vocal settings, or whatever it is. And then I'll just throw a couple of pictures in there, and I always do them high resolution, especially if you're dealing with a mic preamp or anything that doesn't have, the dented.
Right. And you got to really zoom in to see what's going on. You got to zoom in
like on an API or something like that. Not API. No, APIs do some of the sweeping on the mic pre's, like you said, to really get detailed. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I would do on something like that.
So 2 thoughts real quick. I like what you're describing as a version for doing it, because when you go open that song, you see the folder right there. You don't have to go digging around looking to see if you had recall photos. So they're right there and there. However, a lot of times when I'm working on something, the recalls, I might be busy recording and my intern or assistant might be doing the recall photos for me. And so they don't really have a way to get the photos to me and into the folder. It's too much of a weak link in the chain where it could get forgotten about at the end of the session, not going there. Mm-hmm. So in our case, having Google Drive folders and just having an organization like that, they can easily upload stuff to it. They can even do it if they forget and they're on their way home, God forbid.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that there's a lot of ways, with any aspect of what we do, there's a lot of ways to skin that cat. Yeah. And so what works for you because you have a certain type of workflow. And it's the same thing for me. Which
is great. I love to try and dig into details on the show because it sparks ideas for people, whether they're doing something very similar or had never thought of it before. But you're absolutely right. In the end, Rockstars, you have to come up with your own methods, try some stuff. You're going to go like, oh crap, man, those guys, it sounded totally cool. But when I do it, it's like a pain in the butt. And then I got to do this here and then that there. And my computer doesn't do this. And then you come up with your own method that works for you, which is fine. How about jumping forward? So how do you set gain, EQ, and compression for vocals? I know that's kind of a general question, but let me know any thoughts you have about doing that so that it sounds great.
This can go into a really big rabbit hole. Something your listeners should do, but be wary of, is read gear sluts. My converters, find out what they're calibrated to. And that's where I start with gain. So my Antelope, which I have the Orion 32 Plus, which I love, is set at -18. As -18 dBFS, which would be 0 VU, which is how you would, if you're running tone through a console or a piece of gear, that would essentially -18 in the digital world with my Orion would look like 0 VU on a VU meter.
Right.
So I will tend to it depends on the source. If it's a vocal, I'll tend to keep it a little bit more -18, -15. But that's not to say that the peaks may not go a little higher. I'm just looking for an average around there. If it's a drum or anything real percussive, you can go hotter with that. So that would be a rough gain staging kind of thing in the manual for any of the, A to D converters. It'll tell you what it's calibrated at. And EQs, if it's a vocal, generally, I'll with the Neve, I'll shelve out anything below 50, and I'll give a 12K bump of 2 dB, just so that you're not getting any rumbly kind of stuff, and you're not getting and it's not too dull, because you've got the high shelf boost. And then I might put in a little bit of mids. I don't know. It really depends on the source.
Yeah, what you're feeling at that. Moment.
Yeah, absolutely. If I'm tracking guitar, it'll be different. If I'm tracking drums, it'll be different.
And is it okay to not add an EQ?
Absolutely. If you don't have to do something, don't do it. Ultimately, if you don't have to add EQ, don't feel like you have to. If you don't have to add compression, don't add compression.
What are some compression plugins that you enjoy or might find yourself going to pretty quickly to try out?
Are you talking about on the tracking end?
Yeah, I mean, you described a system where you're pulling up some plugins and you're tracking a vocal. So what's a compression plugin you might typically grab?
I mean, I might go grab the CLA 76s.
Mm-hmm.
I like those. Those are kind of cool.
Yeah, the classic compressors.
Yeah. I will go for the Bluey on vocals because it does have a little bit more of the mid-forward presence on things. Yeah. I've recorded through the Slate stuff, and it's great. And like that VMR thing, and I've done UAD. I've kind of done all of it. But what you do want to look out for with a plugin, if you're using it, like what I was saying earlier about printing a vocal through it, find something that has zero latency with it.
Right.
Because if you're already dealing with a little bit of it, you don't want to add on top of that.
Right. Some plugins take up a lot of processing juice and might add, thousands of samples delay onto that track.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now that is a good reminder, though. Your vocalist might not know to tell you that they're hearing a delay.
Exactly. Yeah, especially if they're inexperienced.
Yeah. So do you have a second pair of headphones going for your? Well, I guess really the only way is you have to go out on the mic and put on the headphones and talk into it. And as an engineer, you notice it right away. Yeah.
I mean, when I'm setting up for the session, I'll know it before they even get there.
Nice. Talk about the importance of setting up for a session and before they get there. And do you hand them a pair of headphones and let them put them on while you're tweaking all this stuff out and plugging things in and patching things into the computer?
No, that's done. They don't see anything. So when they come in, there are, if I've already got the lyrics, I've got a music stand ready to go that is carpeted behind it, which deals with reflections, especially if they need the music stand higher.
So when you say carpeted behind it, you mean if it's like a Manhasset metal stand, you put a piece of carpet on the metal part? Yeah,
I've got a carpet square, which you can go find, just go get a scrap somewhere at a carpet place. But so I've got that ready to go. The mic stand and the mic is on. I've already been warming up my mic for about an hour before that. Mm-hmm. I always put an alert in my phone to do that, because I have forgotten before.
Nice.
I will get a little bit of a rough gain stage. It kind of is always the same. I'll kind of use it as a starting place. There will be headphones ready to go in there. I'll have a little table thing for, water or, anything like that ready to go. But I've already tested everything. I've already troubleshooted everything. So it's rare that anyone gets here and I'm still fiddling with anything. The only thing that I will do that I'll fiddle with once they get here is once we start kind of running down, we're getting headphone mix going for them, is I will do the final gain staging and EQing and seeing what I'm hearing while they're doing that. And I'll tell them, you might hear the level jump a little bit up or down. Mm-hmm. I will correct quickly for that as I'm going, but I'm just letting you know that may happen. I've got reverb set up. I've got everything ready to roll before they walk in the door.
Okay, so what do you do if you've got a singer who is sort of doing an intimate, quieter part in the verses, but they're belting on the choruses? How do you address the gain structure for your vocal?
Oh boy. I've done it a couple of ways. Sometimes we'll just track the verse, separate from the choruses.
And you set the gain for what sounds great for the verse?
Generally, I'll probably more than likely set it what sounds great for the chorus, because just in terms of raw level. Mm-hmm. But if the sonic quality, not from their voice, but from the actual recording itself is changing too much, we'll look at, cutting them separately. I've even gone in and done the old school way where you learn the song as you go, and I will actually take the output of my Brent Averill and adjust it on the fly.
Nice.
Yeah. So if I need to, have the input hotter in the verse, and then I'll back it down, whatever, 20%, 25% for the choruses, I will do that. And that was something that goes back to the tape days, because they were trying to deal just with noise. and getting rid of noise.
Just trying to get enough level onto tape.
And not killing the tape if, something happened, a big note, or whatever. So I've done that before too. And that's a little nerve wracking, but, you do what you got to do. And some of that is just being forced to think really in unorthodox ways.
Well, I'm going to bring back something else you mentioned when you talked about don't be afraid to record with two mics. So an example I might think of is you've got this U47 mic, which just sounds wonderful on some stuff, but sometimes tube mics can sound strident and over mid-range aggressive on certain voices. Like my U67 will get that way sometimes with a female voice if it's really pushing. And maybe a great second mic, which seems to have no trouble handling loud vocals, is an SM7. So maybe you can set up, your tube mic to just be killer and warm and deep and luscious on the verses and pre-choruses. But when the notes are belting on the chorus, you just switch over to the SM7 and you get a different sound for that sounds great. So just an idea. These are the kind of things I might experiment with, And
a lot of that has to do with the tools that you have available to you.
Yeah.
You have to solve the problem with the tools you have.
Yeah, exactly. And the less tools you have, the faster you'll learn.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yes.
All right, so let's talk about some tips for comping vocals. What do you use and how do you do it?
I'm in Pro Tools. So what I'll do is I'm a big quick keys guy. So we'll run, if we're running just the verse or whatever, I'll go through and, I think it's Control and then like the backslash. We'll create a new playlist. If I'm doing a punch, but I want to keep what was there, I'll do Apple Control backslash, which duplicates the playlist.
Yep.
And, go through that way. And so once the tracking is all done, I'll then, I've had songs with 100 playlists. It more than likely wasn't the case of doing 100 complete takes, but it might have been, we're trying to get this one part right, or we had a bunch of ideas for a certain part of the song and there might be 25 options. That kind of thing. But I'll do, I think you hold down Control and Command and click like a down arrow that's next to the track name in the edit window. And that splits out all the takes.
Right. It unzips them into playlists where you can see them all, right?
Yeah. And so I'll just go through and, I comp everything. I comp the drums. I comp, essentially do a band comp, and I'll also do the vocals that way. And I'll just listen to phrases. If it's the vocals, I'll generally listen to a line or two and then find, okay, this is, or even the whole verse, depending on how long it is, this is my foundation for the verse. And then I might go listen for a specific word that might have been sung better, or there might have been an emotion that was a little more authentic. And so I'll go through that process, and it is laborious. I generally will take a lot more breaks during that time because I'm choosing I'm choosing what the record sounds like.
Right.
I'm choosing the parts of the record at that point. And so I'll do that and, just kind of play it through, and I'll listen to my verse when I think I've got a comp, and I might say, I don't like that anymore. I'm going to go try this. And I'll get a complete vocal, if that's what we're talking about, and I'll send it to the client, artist, or backer, or, whomever is involved. And I'll just say, hey, what do you think of this comp? If there's anything that you don't like, let me know, and I'll go back and look for it. And sometimes I'll take a day or two. I'll comp a couple of songs over the course of a couple of days and then take a couple of days of break from listening to those songs and then come back and listen to the comp and say, oh, okay, that's good. Or I gotta look at a couple of spots here. Or I have an idea for something that we don't have yet, and we come back in and do that.
Another good reason to get those recall photos.
Yeah. Or, quite honestly, if I'm in the middle of a project, I just leave everything set up.
Yeah, totally. I like doing that when I can here too. Right. So when you are comping, you're taking all these takes that are take numbers, it says like vocal 1, vocal 2, vocal 3, whatever. And then when you make the comp, do you have a system for naming that track so you know which one it is that you're comping onto?
Yeah, I will just name it, if it's, depending on how I do it. Sometimes I'll, if we're tracking different sections of the song separately, I'll create, a verse track, a chorus track, and a bridge track, say, and I'll just call it verse LV comp. That's what I call it. And another thing with the naming conventions, if you know that you're going to be doing multiple takes of something, I will always start with, like verse LV.01.
Right.
I will always start with 01 so that I can always go back to just having verse LV. And a number, even if I would never go back to not having a number at some point in the project, the number will always tell me where it is at in the list. Because if I get, verse LV.13, I know exactly where to go look for that if I need to go split the comp out again.
Because it should be 13 in the list, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
Now, what is your verse LV? Is that going to be your comp track, or is that just the first take?
No, verse LV, in general, now that I'm thinking about it, in general, I'm actually never not using some sort of delineating thing there. So I'm always using either a number or it'll say comp, verse LV comp. And the only time I get rid of that is once I go to mix it. I'll rename everything fresh.
Yeah. There's one other thing where I find communication breakdown happens or can happen is when the artist walks in, whether it's a band and they just did band takes or it's a singer and they just sang a few. And then they walk in and you go, and you're looking at Pro Tools numbers now. And you just, as the engineer, you don't want to have, vocal.02 and then, be trying to call that take 3 at the same time and like do this mental gymnastics to communicate it to the artist. So, but I also don't call it take 2 because then they get confused as an artist because they're like, that wasn't the second take.
Yeah.
So I just will call it, I'll just say, okay, this one's called vocal.02 and I'll just call it what it is on Pro Tools and let them, get used to the new numbers.
Yeah, I have found that's the cleanest way of working, for me is to just keep it there. And one thing that I'll do is as I'm tracking, if they sing a line, if I know that we're going to go 15 whatever takes in, if they sing a line and I want to remember that, I will actually highlight that, separate the region.
Leave it in the take or in the playlist, but have this separated region right there.
I'll have it separated, but to know, because now I've got 3 regions. At that point, I've got the one before it, I've got the one that I like, and I've got the region after it.
Right.
And I'll put a little plus symbol or an asterisk there, and that tell me.
In the name.
Yeah, exactly. It'll rename the file right there. And so that'll tell me when I go to comp this, I need to pay attention to this take because I liked it on the tracking day.
Yeah, that's smart. I mean, I don't remember if Pro Tools will let us do this easily, but it'd be cool to also come up with a color scheme where you're like, green is the one I always mark those regions or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I don't think you can have different colors per track.
Yeah. You might be able to fly it straight to the comp real quickly. And I do that sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, my comps look like, I always call them the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Right. Totally.
Because they look like a rainbow.
So, all right. So now you've got a track called LV, 1 comp, and that's where you've just comped everything to. Now, what do you do when you're like, oh, I'm going to keep that comp, but I think I'm going to try this alternate comp, which is likely going to be the one we're going to use. What do you name that next track? And do you just do like a duplicate comp track and go from there?
I'll duplicate because that comp track is just another playlist. And so what I'll do is I'll just duplicate that playlist and just name it comp 2. And if it's something major or whatever, I might make a note of that in the comments box in Pro Tools as to why I made 2 different comp versions. I could say there's a, verse 2 alternate third line, whatever, but I'll make a note as to why I did that.
So the thing that I never liked about that process was, especially on, long records where you're working on stuff over and over again and coming back to it and, spending a long time, you can't even remember in your head
Right.
where you left off. And if I had a comp track, so I would just use the letter C and then I duplicated it, would now be called like C.01, C.02. And I wouldn't necessarily know that C.02 was the very final version of the comp.
Yeah.
Because like if it got flipped back to C.01 by accident or I was moving quickly, I'd come back to it and I wouldn't realize that I was listening to the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So, I've tried different things. I've even tried having a system that says, nope, the vocal C track is always the master comp. And if I do an alternate, I'll duplicate it, but then I'll go back to C to work on it. So it's more like spitting off copies, but just something to think about, rock stars. When you come up with a system, make sure you're aware that your system should be Loctite somehow.
Yeah, I mean, naming conventions are huge, not only in your sessions, within the sessions, but also naming conventions within the project and keeping those really consistent. Like I create a new Pro Tools session for every new thing that gets done. So by the time a song gets done, I might have 20 or 30 Pro Tools sessions.
Yeah.
And it's my system. I developed it over the course of I guess probably 15 years, and it works for me.
Well, there's a good reminder in there too that we work in a community of musicians and producers and engineers, and it behooves us to develop systems that work for us. But remember that when, if our session was just handed off to a strange new engineer and they just had to open it and look at it and understand where we left off and what was going on, if we're able to have a system that somebody else can look at and go, oh, that's clear, I can tell where to go with it, then that's a pretty good way to, really collaborate well with the rest of the world.
Yeah, the organization is great. I will typically not send a session. If I need someone to like lay down something, I don't know, guitar or whatever, I typically will not send them the multi-track. That's just me, because I don't want them to have to worry about figuring out what is going on. I just want them to do the awesome thing that they do.
Yeah, totally.
And, that kind of thing. Now, with Ted, it was different because Ted, I was actually doing that kind of collaboration with. And I actually had to.
You probably just had to learn his.
I had to learn his. Exactly. And so his became part of mine because I got so used to it, and it ended up just making sense to me. So like when I'm done with a vocal, like with a lead vocal, it will say LV, like verse LV tattoo, which is TATU, which means time aligned and tuned.
Nice.
That was something I got from Ted. And he was like, I need you to do this because this is my way. I need you to do it my way. And that was hugely helpful. And I actually still use that exact same naming convention to this day.
It's good. It's a good reminder. If you're paying the bills, if you're paying the salary, then you get to tell everybody to use your way. But you better have a good way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even if you don't, you still got to go. You still got to go with it. But it is, people will like you more. We'll put it that way. If you have a good one.
All right. So, what sort of common effects should we expect to try when mixing vocals? What are some good go-to? And I don't mean necessarily the specific plugins. You can get into that if you want, but just like techniques for creating a vocal effects that are really useful in mixes.
It really starts with the source material. What is the song? What is the song calling for? Is the song calling for a really long haul, or a shorter, brighter plate, or even a room? I've used room reverb for vocals.
Why don't you describe three, like what pops into your head as three styles of music that might call for each of those differently?
Yeah,
and musically, why it would call for that?
Yeah, so like I might do indie music with or singer-songwriter kind of thing, more with a room. If they want a more intimate sound. If it's something that's like a pop ballad or like a John Legend, kind of thing. you could go for the longer haul or plate, that kind of thing, because there's more space for it.
Right.
I'm also big on, I love delays. I love slap delays and anything that's timed to the tempo of the song. And so I'm big on that stuff. I love delay throws, which is, like a delay maybe just on a word, and that you'll hear it. It'll repeat a couple of times after it.
Now let me interject this. I know that CLA, Chris Lord-Alge, his vocal signature plugin does have like an effects plugin that you can throw up where it is a little switch you can actually throw into a delay.
Yeah.
Do you have a way that is simple that you will throw delays when you set stuff up in Pro Tools, or will you just literally go in and automate it each time and stuff like that?
I will sometimes, depending on what it is, I will automate the return of that effect. Or if it's in the middle of a line, I might automate the send, like a mute on the send. And so but either way, it's done with automation.
So here, I'm thinking of a good example for the rock stars. So I just want to throw this delay, like that, right? So rock stars, if you put that much delay on the entire line I just did, it would be all clogged up pretty quickly. But if you just, and Ryan, help me out with this, but if you unmute it right on the syllable lay of delay, then you get that echo of just that last word, right? Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yep. And if you do, there's two different results depending on how you do it. If you automate like a mute on the return, that whole line is still sending the delay or signal to the delay. I'm sorry. So if you unmute the return, you will hear more than just the word lay. You'll hear more than that. If you automate the mute on the send, it's not sending anything to that delay until that word. And so it's way cleaner, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So now one thing that can happen is when you do a mute, it's an instant on, and you could actually get a pop into the word, which now is popping into the reverb or the delay. But you brought up Steve Marcantonio, so I'll give a shout out to Steve and share a tip that he shared on his podcast episode, which could be helpful in that situation too, where he said he'll take that lead vocal track and he'll duplicate it onto another track that's only sending to the delay. And you could actually like mute everything and just carefully unmute certain regions or phrases. And, you could put a little fade into that syllable and really, really control the send to that effect. But of course, you're also going to be dealing with like, well, I may have to duplicate all those plugins I had to get the vocal sound and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I mean, my mix sessions, because I was, like I said, kind of at the tail end of console world, I had a finite amount of tracks. So even in the box, I'm generally not mixing any more than 50 audio tracks. I do a lot of comping, which is a whole other thing we could get into, but I don't think we have time. But because I don't want to deal with high track counts, so my process in doing things like a delay throw is learning how to do it with still keeping in that limited amount of tracks and not duplicating the track.
Right.
If I have to do it, I will, because in the end, all I want is the result. But if I can keep the result within what I normally do workflow wise, that's my preference.
All right, dig it. So I believe it was one of the tracks that I listened to of yours was sort of like a younger female artist, and there was just a lot of great auto-tune stuff going on. And I wanted to ask you whether or not you are dealing with, kind of going for that super pop auto-tune thing in the production or the mix stage. And if so, can you talk to us about that? What are some ways to get, super auto-tune sounds? What are some tools we might want to use? Is it literally just auto-tune? Is that the only one, or are there alternates?
Yeah, I mean, there's alternates you can use. I mean, auto-tune, obviously, if you do the super extreme, settings, will get you that T-Pain, which is kind of what it's come to be known. I learned about it first from that Cher song, Do You Believe in Life After Love? Yep. That's where I had heard it first. And this could be an old wives' tale, but I actually heard it was an accident that happened.
And then they dug it?
Yeah, and then they were like, "Oh man, that's actually kind of cool." So, yeah, you can do it with auto-tune. You can do it in Melodyne as well. It's a little bit more, well, not a little bit more. It's a lot more laborious, but you
Yeah.
have a lot more control. Or you can do it with a vocoder type plugin. I've used Waves makes it Morphoder, whatever that's called. It's a vocoder plugin. And
So does that mean
stuff that way?
are you hearing the voice come through, or you're just hearing the synth return, or is it because you're having to play them with your fingers on the keyboard that you get that kind of control for the melody?
It is, you can do it. I mean, if it's like a true vocoder, yeah, then you're playing the melody. That's kind of the Daft Punk thing.
Right.
But the Mofoder kind of gets me most of that without the work, because that's doing that kind of stuff isn't as much what I do. And so if there's like a line that is in the middle of a song that an artist might want, then we can do that. And I find that I don't need to go necessarily dive into all kinds of deep stuff. And 9 times out of 10, honestly, auto-tune will do it.
Yeah. All right. How about, what are some great tricks as far as getting our vocals to sound bigger than life? If I just took the plain Jane mic that we recorded and put it in the mix, it might sound a little flat, but you might know some things that involve, hyping and enhancing it and making it sound wider and just like this big giant thing. Hip us to some stuff that we should think about with that. Is it, if we've got 3 effects on a vocal all at once, is that too many, or is that not even close to enough?
I go back to depends on the song, how much you want to put on there. I will do things, I start with EQ and compression, see what that gets me. And my reverbs and delays. I'll do things like if I want a more intimate sound on the verse that isn't quite so big or effects heavy, I will automate down reverb returns and delay returns and anything like that, and then ride them up for the chorus. Right. And that will get the chorus bigger. I'll also do the old H3000 trick, with the doubling and widening and all that stuff. And I'll 9 times out of 10, that's only in the choruses and bridge. And what that does is I put that on all my vocals as an equal send, and I'll send it to a return that has that on it, and I'll sneak that in, and it just gives the vocals a spread, if you will. Yeah. That not having it doesn't have. Now, if you push it too far, it'll start to sound a little watery, I might call it, a little phasey, chorusy. But if you use it subtly, it's great. I know Andy Wallace does it on bass. And which widening bass in rock music. I mean, not many guys do that, at least that I know, unless I'm totally out of the loop. But
no, I think I heard Shakir King talking about that once too, which I thought was pretty hip.
Yeah, but I've never as much gotten into that, but that's me. But so there's that kind of stuff, wideners. There's a plugin that is really cool for that still maintains the mono compatibility, which is really important anytime you're using any kind of spreading psychoacoustic kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. JST, which I think is Joey Sturgis Tones, makes a plugin called the Side Widener. Oh, cool. Side widener, something like that. And it is the best one that I personally have found for certain things. I actually don't use it on the vocal thing. I use it on something else, but it still will preserve mono compatibility.
Can I use it on my thinning hair? Because that sounds like that would help a lot too.
Yeah, the side widener, get those corners.
Well, that's hip, man. Let's see. Yeah. So you're using the H3000. Yeah, I guess you can answer my question. I was going to ask if there were more go-to plugins that people might look for widening.
Yeah, the widening. I like the Waves that has the doubler. That's cool. Mm-hmm. I like I'm a huge fan of anything that Sound Toys makes. They just make great, really, really killer stuff. So
which of the Sound Toys would you choose out of their collection?
For the widening?
Yeah.
You could either go with the Phase Mistress, will do it. You could go even with the Echo Boy will do it. Short echoes, or you could go with they have an H3000 type plugin called Microshift that is really cool. That will do things like that. How do you like
to let's assume for a minute that in order to go explore those options, it's time consuming. We have to do it sort of off the clock and when we've got a moment to play around with some stuff and experiment. Yeah. And then we find something that's pretty cool and we want to just save it for later. What's a good system for, collecting and saving this stuff so that it's useful in a tight timer situation across multiple plugins?
Yeah, I mean, that goes into the template world. And every DAW, you can create templates. My template is in its own session. And so it has all of the routing done. It has all of the plugins done. It has all of the settings ready to go. It's routed. It's all that stuff. And so my template is all of my effects returns as well as my two-bus processing. It's all ready to go. And other than delay times and delay throw effects, I'm generally not changing a whole lot.
Okay, so you can start building a mix to work on, and then you might just import a bunch of these templated effects over, and it's as if you had just patched in all your effects behind you in the studio that you were familiar with.
Yeah, and I'll do all that stuff even before I'll do that stuff the day before I sit down and mix. If I'm sent a record to mix, I'll spend 2 or 3 days prepping the record, and that's all that kind of stuff, as well as organization, comping anything that needs to be comped, printing samples if I want to do that. I'll do all of that, and then I'll sit down to mix as if I had an assistant set everything up for me. And now I just sit down at the desk and go, because I don't want to be patching stuff digitally in this case.
Yeah.
While I'm mixing, I just want to go.
Now, would you, if you load in all these template things, is it sometimes still like a little too much for the computer to handle? And do you need to sort of disable certain tracks and enable them when you need them, or do you find that even that is too much of a slowdown? And that really you just want to have everything right there where you can grab a send and send it to stuff?
I have everything right there. And one of the things that is a benefit of working with lower track counts is the processing power requirement is less. And it's just because you don't need physically as many plugins. If I'm sent a session that has 100 tracks in it, but I've got, say 12 gang vocals all singing the same part, there's no reason for me to have 12 tracks of that to work with. I will just, I'm not big on using auxes for that stuff. I'll just print a stereo capacitite and just use that, because, if there's separate parts of a gang vocal, like if there's 12 of one part, 12 of a third above, and then a fifth above vocal parts, I'll just basically have 3 stereo tracks as opposed to 36 individual tracks that I just don't need.
How much treatment and commitment do you need to do, commitment of treatment do you need to do to those in that bouncing down process? Is there a risk that we're going to over process that as we bounce them down and then go, oh crap, this sounds terrible later?
Sure.
Is it better to err on the side of just kind of doing natural dry blends because you can always affect it as a group later?
I will commit. Yeah. And when I'm talking about comping this stuff down, it's all dry. It's all just whatever is sent to me combined. I'm not at that point printing any effects. If there is some stuff, I'll print plugins. I don't have a problem with that. If I've got, a track that is, dynamically way out of control and I don't want to deal with that in the mix, I want to sit down to a mix of what I would call really, really well recorded tracks.
Right.
And I don't want to be fixing in the mix. I'll fix, for lack of better terms, in the prep stage.
Right.
In my organization.
It's kind of like you can deal with what you got right now in the present and print it as is, but don't go backwards in production necessarily,
Yeah. I mean, if you don't have to, there's no reason to. I would, but I know when I'm sent the rough mix and I listen to the raw tracks, I'll have a pretty good idea pretty quickly of anything that I need to go through and work on. Unfortunately, I'll get stuff sometimes where the session is a mess and I've got to organize it. And there's like fades that are bad. I mean, if I'm sent a session, I like to be sent consolidated tracks. That's if I'm not mixing something I'm producing, I send consolidated files. I don't want anyone to have to guess. I don't want anyone to have playlists or anything like that. So I'll deal on my stuff with all of that beforehand. And stuff I'm sent to mix, like I said, I want stuff that sounds like it was recorded well, it was organized well. So if that means that I need to go through and do a bunch of stuff to it, I will, so that when I sit down to do the purely creative side, I'm only being creative.
Right. You're not getting derailed.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I can liken it to is it's way better to be a chef and have a sous chef that will cut everything for you and pre-measure everything for you. And then you can go do your cooking show.
Nice.
And you don't have to think about it. You do what you're good at, and that's it.
And 2 ovens, you put one in one oven, then you go to the other one and pull it out and it's already finished.
Yeah, it's like, who has that? Like, good Lord.
All right, groovy, man. Well, we've been going for a good long stretch here. So let me jump straight to the final jam session questions and just ask you a couple. There was one, you've already given us a bunch of great hardware and software tools. So I don't know if there's anything you didn't cover, you can bring it up now. But you did mention wanting to touch on sort of some advice for the business aspect of being a producer and an engineer. So let me just hand it over to you. What would you like to share with the rock stars?
Yeah, I think something that people need to find is, whether you're an engineer or a producer, people don't think of it in those roles as much as they do with artists, but you need to find your champion. You need to find someone who likes you, or in the least tolerates you, that thinks you have a lot of potential and speaks hard truths to you, speaks praises to you, speaks criticisms to you, any of that stuff, so that you can be better. They are also people that tend to be more connected than you within the music industry. And this is true in any business. But I've been fortunate to have 2 of those in various capacities. One of them, of course, is Bob, who has been mainly on the producing end of things and telling me, no, this isn't, early on, no, this isn't good. You can do better. Go back. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. To now, it's the conversations that he and I have are much different. They're less, you need to get better, and they're more,
need to stop sucking.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. But they're more, just being creative and challenging each other that way. I have another one. Her name is Terry Brown. Now, Terry has been in the business really since the 60s, and she's managed some of the biggest artists to come out of Nashville, but she also worked with Hallmark for several years and Budweiser for several years at doing consulting work. And she is someone that knows the business, the ins and outs, and has so much wisdom. And I met her through my aunt and uncle, but our relationship is very separate from them. And she and I talk almost every day. And she's the type of person that will kick your butt and then give you a hug afterward,
Nice.
Kind of thing. But she is someone that, recognizing my abilities, recognizing the skills there, has set up meetings for me. She has been willing to professionally attach her name to mine, which is risky, for anybody to do that. So I've been in meetings that I had no way of getting in otherwise, on my own. I've been a part of projects because of her that are the same. And the same thing, with Bob, being a part of projects that I wouldn't be a part of, unless it was for him. And so I think finding someone that is that encourager, that can be a mentor, and finding someone, I heard a great quote the other day, was find a mentor that doesn't have time to mentor you. Because if they're taking the time to tell you something, it means they care.
Right.
And so that's just a really big thing for me. Find your champion. Find someone who will fight for you.
I think that's good advice. I mean, I've had some great mentors when I started out. And then, even today, it's like whatever the new thing is whatever new adventures I'm on, those are opportunities for me to find a new mentor. But I do remember experiencing also, like even as an intern, seeing the owner of the studio take on, he mentored another guy, and I remember feeling like I was like, wow, man, I'm not really getting any love here, and this other guy doesn't know as much as me, which was frustrating for me. But I think my takeaway later was realizing that mentorship, like, don't consider yourself unqualified for that mentorship. It may be a lot more to do with the connection that you might have and whether or not you just fit,
Yeah,
So
no, absolutely.
be willing to take a risk and go out and introduce yourself and meet people who are, like you said, really well-positioned, really professional, and don't have time to mentor you because they might just want to take you under their wing. And that's a huge advantage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Dig it. Well, so let's jump right forward to our final question, our closeout.
Sure.
It's hypothetical, but we're going to take the Wayback Studio machine and you get to go back in time and find young Ryan tuning banjos or whatever it was, or no, much younger than that.
Yeah.
And give yourself one bit of advice. Say, young Ryan, I am your father.
Yeah.
No, not really, but
yeah.
I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
I would say get ready to have no social life. Because I made a choice 50% consciously, 50% subconsciously to not like have a girlfriend. I didn't date. I didn't party when I was in college. I was not, and that's not any kind of judgment. That's just me saying I wanted to spend my time doing this. And so I did. And part of not having a social life is due to the fact that it's the 10,000 hours principle.
But now you party now that you got 2 kids, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. That's exactly what 2 kids means. Yeah. My social calendar is exploding. No, it's different now with, having a family. I'm married. I've been married for over 10 years and I've got 2 boys that I love.
Congrats.
And thank you. It's a different challenge, but, and this does take up time. I've had to learn how to get very structured with my time and making sure that I'm being as efficient as I can, not only with work, but, with family as well. And it doesn't always work, but I try my best at it. But as a younger self that wasn't married, that wasn't anything like that, it's okay that you don't do anything else.
Right.
Because everyone that I've been around, for the most part, that got really good at this, didn't do anything else either.
Right.
So there's like this little support group of social rejects that happen to be really good in the studio. And that's okay. And that's really what, and I've told a couple of kids that have come over and like, I'm friends with their parents or something and they're thinking about getting into music. And I tell them all that at the same time. It's not like, I don't mean to freak you out, but you need to be okay with, well, you can't play basketball and you can't play football and you can't do this and you can't do that. You can't date. You can't do this, because there's such a time commitment to all of those things, none of them being bad. But if you want to get good at this, it takes a lot of time.
Yep. 10,000 hours.
10,000 hours.
Well, groovy, man. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with us. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here, Ryan.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Let the rock stars know how they can find you and learn more about you online.
I am on Instagram at rsutton81. And you can just find me on Facebook, Ryan Sutton. And those are the best ways to reach me.
Awesome, dude. Well, thanks again. I look forward to hanging out again in person. And thank you for joining us on Skype so that you could be there. I guess you have a sleeping child who's not feeling so good today in the nearby. So good thing he was a wonderful sleeper. I thank him too.
Yeah, right.
All right, man. Thanks so much, dude. Totally awesome stuff you shared. And I know the rock stars are going to be really happy to hear from you as well.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.
All right, man. Cheers. We'll see you around.
Thanks.
Peace. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.